Have you ever heard a sentence so ordinary that it didn't just hurt? It rearranged something inside you, like someone casually shifting the furniture of your soul without permission. I didn't know a small cluster of words could feel like a quiet eviction notice, but that morning, standing in my own doorway with my hands still damp from washing dishes, I learned how easily a family can tuck you into the background of their plans without even noticing the sound you make when your heart folds. They said it gently, the way people say things they think you're too old or too polite to be wounded by. You're too old to travel with us, Grandma. Just watch the house for us, okay? And the softness in their voices didn't make the sting any smaller. It simply wrapped the hurt in pretty paper. I remember the way they laughed as they carried their bags to the car, not cruelly, just carelessly, like my existence was a familiar piece of furniture they were certain would always be there, no matter how often they walked past without looking. I remember how I forced a smile wide enough to hide the tremble rising in the corners of my mouth, how I lifted my hand to wave, even though everything inside me felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and how I shut the door behind them in slow motion, because shutting it quickly would have felt like admitting the truth, that I'd become something to leave behind. Funny how hooks lodge themselves in our hearts without warning. The moment the engine of their car faded down the street, a quiet voice inside me whispered, "When did you stop being invited? When did you become optional?" But instead of interrogating the ache, I walked back inside, made myself busy wiping an already clean countertop, and convinced myself that this is what aging gracefully must look like, shrinking softly so others have more room to bloom. And yet, the next morning, as sunlight crept across my porch like it was looking for me, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope addressed in neat travel agency handwriting that didn't belong there. Inside were their plane tickets, departure dates, seat numbers, bright glossy paper stamped with a future I wasn't meant to be part of. I held them in my hands for a long moment, those printed rectangles warm from the morning heat, and something inside me did a small, rebellious twist. Why were they in my mailbox? Why didn't they take them? Why didn't they even check? That's when the different hook tugged at me. If they didn't need the tickets enough to keep track of them, why was I expected to keep track of myself and their lives? I set the envelope on the kitchen table, made tea the way I always do when emotions threaten to spill over, but the steam rising from the cup didn't steady my fingers like it usually does. My hand shook, almost invisibly, but enough for me to notice that something in me wasn't just upset, it was waking up. I kept staring at those tickets, at the names printed neatly beside each seat number, and at the blank space where my name should have been, the blank space that felt louder than any insult could ever be. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you realize you've been left behind, not because you're incapable, but because someone decided your presence wasn't essential. My voice startled me with how calm it sounded. "I'd like to cancel these tickets," I said, and the woman on the other end hesitated, as if she wasn't sure an old voice could carry a decision so sharp. "May I ask why, ma'am?" I could have told her 1,000 reasons. Because being left behind feels like being erased. Because I'm tired of being the dependable shadow. Because they didn't even think about how it felt. But all I said was, just cancel them. And it was strangely liberating how an entire world of unspoken truths could fit into 3 quiet words. As she confirmed the cancellation number, I felt something inside me click, not break, but shift, as if the ground beneath me had rolled forward a few inches. I hung up the phone and sat back in the chair where I'd once rocked my son to sleep, years before he grew into a man who decided I was too old to join him on a vacation. I let my eyes wander around the room, family photos, memories stacked on shelves, little pieces of a woman who used to be invited into the center of her family's life instead of standing at the doorway of it. And while the house was still the same, I wasn't. Not anymore. A quiet question echoed in my head, one I could no longer silence. What if being left behind wasn't the end of something, but the beginning? The morning suddenly felt different, not softer, not lighter, just open like the first crack in a long locked window. And as I stared at the tickets I'd just erased from existence, I felt the faintest pull towards something I hadn't felt in decades possibility. Canceling their trip wasn't revenge. It was the first small, trembling step toward a life I didn't know I still had the courage to touch. Have you ever made a decision so quietly that even you didn't realize life had shifted, until the moment you felt your own heartbeat answer back? Finally, that's how it felt the afternoon. I stood in my hallway, staring at the empty space where the canceled tickets had been, like the absence itself was whispering a dare I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept. For most of my life I'd moved in small, careful motions, steady steps, predictable routines, the soft dance of someone who doesn't want to trouble the room she's in. But that day, as I opened the drawer where my passport lay tucked beneath old receipts and a pair of reading glasses, there was a different kind of tremble in my fingers. Not fear exactly, but a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it approaches like a shy guest, waiting to see if you'll open the door wide enough to let it in. I held the passport to my chest for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling my own weight, and an intrusive hook tugged at me. When was the last time you went somewhere for yourself, not because someone needed you to be there? The answer stung. I couldn't remember, and that was reason enough. Before I could think myself out of the moment, before doubt could slip its familiar fingers around my throat, I sat down at my old computer, the one my grandson teased me about, and typed in the first destination that came to mind. Maybe because their canceled tickets whispered it. Maybe because something in me wanted to reclaim the very thing I'd been denied. When the screen displayed available flights, my stomach fluttered like a teenager about to do something reckless. My hand hovered over the mouse, a ridiculous hesitation for a woman who had raised a family, paid bills, buried a husband, survived more winters than she cared to count. "You can do this," a small voice urged, and before I could talk myself out of joy, I booked a single seat, aisle, early morning departure. No family discount, no group booking, just me, my name, my choice. When the confirmation arrived in my email, I stared at it like it belonged to someone braver. Another hook arrived without warning. What if courage doesn't show up all at once? What if it's built in little decisions like this? I printed the ticket, held the warm paper in my hands, and felt something in me settle into place. The next day was a blur of preparations that felt strangely ceremonial, washing the good scarf I had stopped wearing after my husband passed, choosing sensible shoes that wouldn't shame me in airport lines, folding the navy dress I had once worn to his memorial and then retired out of grief and habit. I didn't tell anyone, not because I wanted secrecy, but because there is a sacredness in doing something for yourself that doesn't require permission, slips, or explanations. I called my neighbor Carol dear, Chatty Carol, who always smells faintly of lavender, and asked her if she could water my plants for a few days. "Oh, going somewhere?" she asked, her voice bright with curiosity. "Just a little trip," I said, surprised by how steady the word sounded. Hooks poked at me, insistent. Why does a simple trip feel like rebellion at your age? Why does independence feel like you're sneaking out past curfew? The night before my flight, I sat on the porch in the quiet dusk, listening to the wind rustle the ivy along the fence, and wondered what my family would say if they could see me packing. Maybe they'd laugh. Maybe they'd worry. Maybe they wouldn't care. The painful truth was that uncertainty didn't hurt as much as it used to. I was learning to unclench my heart from their expectations. When dawn arrived, pale and gentle, I locked my front door, suitcase in hand, and walked down the steps slowly but deliberately, like each step was erasing an old version of me. The taxi driver, a young man with a warm smile and hair too long for his forehead, loaded my suitcase and chatted about traffic. I nodded politely, my mind far away, already walking through the airport I hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. And when I finally stepped inside into the metallic hum of announcements, rolling suitcases, bright screens flashing departures, I felt an odd tightening in my chest, followed by the loosest breath I'd taken in years. No one knew me here. No one expected me to be small. At the check-in counter, the agent, a girl young enough to be my granddaughter, looked at my passport, then at me, and offered a respectful smile that wasn't pitying, wasn't patronizing, just human. "First trip in a while?" she asked gently. I wanted to say yes, but the truth tumbled unexpectedly in my mind. No, this is my first trip as myself. I simply nodded. The security line felt endless, but I didn't care. I watched people rush around me, families bickering over snacks, couples whispering plans, businessmen barking into phones, and instead of feeling out of place, I felt strangely steady, like I finally belonged somewhere simply because I had chosen to be there. On the plane, I settled into my aisle seat, clutching the armrest as the engines rumbled. A young man sat beside me, glanced my way, and offered a kind smile before returning to his book. It was the first time in years that someone looked at me without the invisible label of elderly caretaker. As we took off, my heart jolted, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming realization that I was leaving behind not just a house, not just a routine, but a version of myself that had waited too long for invitations that never came. The sky opened below us, a blanket of white and blue stretching endlessly, and something inside me unfurled with it. I stared out the window, watching the clouds shift, and a quiet thought rose up like a promise. You're not running away. You're stepping toward the part of your life that's been waiting for you. The plane hummed, the world shrank beneath us, and for the first time in years my breath didn't feel borrowed. I wasn't escaping my family. I was finally arriving in my own life, and I had no idea how much more of myself I was about to find. Have you ever stepped into a new place and felt the strange sensation that the air itself was looking at you differently? Not as someone's leftover responsibility, but as a person with a pulse and a story? That's exactly how Athens greeted me, not with fanfare or dramatic music the way movies promise, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if the city itself understood what it meant to arrive after a lifetime of staying put. The moment I stepped outside the airport, the heat hugged me like an old friend who didn't care about the years etched into my skin. It simply asked, "You made it. Now what?" I told the taxi driver the name of the modest little pension I'd booked, speaking slowly because nerves have a way of slipping into your voice even when you try to sound brave. And as the taxi wound through the city, past white buildings, narrow streets, mopeds zipping like impatient bees, I felt a soft stirring inside me, a whisper. What if you finally get to exist without being useful to someone? The pension was small, almost shy-looking, tucked between a bakery and a shop selling handmade soaps, and as soon as I stepped inside, the young woman— no one had called me anything with respect in a long time. Back home I was Grandma, or Mom, or sometimes, "Could you do this for me real quick?" But here I was simply a guest. She handed me a brass key with a ribbon tied to it, and the weight of it in my palm felt symbolic, as if I were being handed entry into a room inside myself I hadn't visited in decades. My room was simple, a small bed, a wooden desk, shutters that creaked a little when I opened them, revealing a narrow street where strangers moved without glancing up. I sat on the bed for a long time, letting the hum of the city seep into me, and a hook tugged hard. When was the last time you sat in a room that wasn't tied to a memory of someone else's needs? The realization hit me, maybe never. I didn't cry, but there was a pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes from realizing how quietly you've been shrinking over the years. After washing my face and brushing my hair back, I wandered outside, letting my feet choose the direction. I ended up in a tiny bakery where the air smelled like warm dough and fresh olives. The old man behind the counter didn't rush me, didn't treat me like a fragile relic, didn't assume I needed help with every step. He handed me a small plate with bread and said, "Sit, cuss, eat slowly." It felt like an invitation to reclaim something I had forgotten. Simple pleasure. As I sat by the window nibbling bread, watching strangers go about their lives without expectations tied to mine, another hook surfaced. What if this was the first time in years no one was waiting for you to come home? And strangely, that didn't feel lonely. It felt liberating. The next morning, after a night of restless sleep that felt strangely exciting instead of painful, I decided to explore the quieter parts of the city, the places the receptionist had described with soft affection. Narrow alleys, sun-drenched walls, cats stretched in doorways like royalty. Everything felt slower, like life here was unhurried enough to let you breathe in full lungfuls. That's when I met her. She was sitting at a small outdoor cafe table, silver hair pinned up with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was, glasses perched low on her nose as she scribbled into a notebook. I wouldn't have paid her more than a passing glance until she spoke without looking up. "You're using too much sunscreen," she said in a dry voice that carried just enough humor to disarm me. I blinked, stunned that a stranger could read me so quickly. "Better than not enough," I replied, unsure whether I should sit or hurry away before awkwardness ruined the moment. She glanced up, eyes sharp and amused. Fair. Something about her presence felt like leaning against a sturdy wall, the kind that doesn't move even if you do. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit. You look like a woman who hasn't had company lately, and I don't mind sharing silence." Not because I was lonely, but because something about her felt familiar, like a version of myself I might have become if life had unfolded differently. "I'm Rosalie," she said, "from Lyon, retired, widowed, traveling alone because solitude is cheaper than therapy." I laughed, an unpolished, surprised laugh I didn't know I still had in me. I told her my name, though I realized with a small sting that I hadn't said it out loud to a new person in years. She nodded like she already knew pieces of me. Rosalie was the kind of woman who didn't shrink to make others comfortable. She filled space without apology, commenting on the chipped pottery, the lazily wandering cats, the uneven stones in the street, with a curiosity that made everything seem important. As we walked together through the quiet neighborhoods, I noticed she didn't ask about my family, not at first. She asked about me, my favorite color, my hobbies, the last time I did something spontaneous. I hesitated before answering because hooks were firing inside me. What hobbies? When did you stop doing things just because you enjoyed them? At lunch, beneath a vine-covered pergola, she finally asked about them. My son, his wife, my grandchildren, and when I told her the truth, she didn't gasp or offer pity. She simply raised her glass and said, "Then, good. You're exactly where you're meant to be, not watching a house, but watching your life open." Her words lodged deep. All afternoon they echoed in my mind, settling in places that had grown hollow from years of being overlooked. And as the sun set over the rooftops, and Athens began to glow with its evening warmth, I felt something shift, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. I didn't come here to escape loneliness. I came here to realize I was never truly alone, not when pieces of myself were beginning to wake up. Have you ever met someone who didn't exactly change your life, but instead held up a mirror and made you see the parts you'd quietly buried under years of being needed by everyone except yourself? Traveling with Rosalie began that way, unexpectedly, gently, like stumbling upon a doorway you didn't know you'd been circling your entire life. After a few days in Athens spent wandering narrow lanes, sharing pastries, and laughing at things neither of us should have found that funny, she asked over breakfast, "Where have you always wanted to go, but never allowed yourself to imagine?" I didn't have to think long. "Florence," I whispered, surprising myself. She tapped her spoon twice on the table, decisive and efficient. Then that's where we're going. And that was that. No overthinking, no permission slip, no weighing of responsibilities. Just two older women with worn shoes and wide-open afternoons, following a sudden tug toward a place my younger self once dreamed of, but mothering years had quietly smothered. On the train to Florence, I watched the countryside roll by like a painting I'd forgotten existed. Golden fields, lazy rivers, tiny houses with red-tiled roofs, and I felt something loosen in my spine, something that had been tight for years, maybe decades. A hook rose in my chest, sharp and insistent. When did you last let the world pass before you, without rushing, without guilt? When did you last let beauty happen to you instead of serving it to others? Rosalie read a book, humming occasionally, her foot tapping to a rhythm only she understood, while I simply sat with my hands folded over my small travel bag, breathing in a way that felt new. By the time we reached Florence, the sunlight felt different, warmer, richer, like the city itself had been dipped in a memory you didn't know you belonged to. We checked into a hotel with creaky floors and windows that opened onto a courtyard where laundry waved like flags of domestic victories. Our room smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish, and I loved it instantly, perhaps because nothing in it reminded me of home. That evening Rosalie insisted we walk across the Arno River, and I followed her even though my knees protested. The Uffizi rose before us like a storybook come to life, and I felt a pull in my chest so unexpected it almost felt like grief, the grief of realizing how many years I'd spent tending to others while quietly starving parts of myself that once felt hungry for the world. Inside, we stood before paintings that had survived centuries, brushstrokes made by hands long gone, colors that refused to fade, stories preserved even when their creators were not, and a hook lodged itself inside me. Why do paintings get to live forever while some women fade long before their time? I didn't speak this aloud, but Rosalie must have sensed the tremor in me because she murmured, "You're allowed to take up space here. This art has waited for you, not the other way around." And for the first time since I arrived in Europe, I believed her. The next days felt dreamlike. Wandering markets, tasting olive oils that felt like liquid sunlight, sitting on stone steps watching the world swirl around us, while pigeons strutted with more confidence than I'd had in years. And yet, every night when I returned to our room, my phone glowed with messages I didn't have the strength or desire to open. My daughter-in-law had sent a few asking about sprinklers and mail. My son sent nothing at first, then short, clipped sentences that felt more like obligations than concern. I ignored them. But then, one evening, a notification blinked with a name I didn't expect. Amelia, my granddaughter. "Grandma, are you okay? I saw a photo of your trip online. Were you really there? You look happy." The message tightened something in me, not like pain, but like a memory stretching awake. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to send words while my emotions shook inside me like loose glass. Instead, I set the phone down and stepped onto the small balcony. The Florence night was warm and full of murmured conversations drifting from open windows. I breathed in, letting the city's quiet bravery seep into me. A hook surfaced, tender and piercing. Why is it so hard to answer the people you love when you're finally living a life they never imagined you'd claim? In the morning, Rosalie asked gently over cappuccinos, "Family?" I nodded. She didn't pry. Instead, she told me about the husband she'd lost, how grief had knocked the color out of her life for years, how she finally decided to paint it back, stroke by stroke, by traveling alone. "The world doesn't stop inviting you just because others stop seeing you," she said, and the words sank deep, like truth settling into old soil. After Florence, we boarded another train. Lisbon this time, because Rosalie wanted music and I wanted a horizon I'd never seen before. The city welcomed us with tile-covered buildings that seemed to hum with stories, steep hills that tested every knee and every ounce of determination we had, and evenings filled with warm wind carrying traces of grilled fish and laughter. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about aging or limits or expectations. I was simply moving, breathing, living. And yet, amid all this awakening, something else flickered in me, a quiet ache for connection, not with the family who'd excluded me, but with the girl who had once run barefoot in her grandmother's kitchen. Amelia, sweet Amelia, who saw me before the world told her not to. I thought about back home, about all the years I'd shown up quietly, faithfully, predictably, and all the years they hadn't noticed the small fractures forming in the corners of my smile. The hook hit hard. What if distance isn't punishment, but protection? What if silence is where healing finally grows? In Lisbon, on a sunlit afternoon, when the ocean breeze carried hints of something like courage, I finally replied to Amelia, a simple message. I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm learning new things about life and about myself. And as we stood that evening on a viewpoint overlooking the city glowing gold under the setting sun, I realized something profound. I didn't travel to escape my old life. I traveled so I could finally meet myself again. Sometimes the world opens just wide enough to show you the parts of yourself you thought were gone forever, and traveling with Rosalie wasn't changing me. It was letting me return to the woman I should have never stopped being. Have you ever woken up one morning and realized you weren't running anymore? Not from people, not from pain, not from expectations, but from the smaller version of yourself you were taught to shrink into? That's exactly what it felt like in Seville, a city that didn't whisper or comfort or soothe. It blazed, insisting you feel alive whether you believed you deserved that aliveness or not. The heat pressed down on us like the sky itself wanted to shake something loose inside, and every street, every courtyard, every echo of flamenco stamping against stone felt like a reminder that life doesn't end when others stop, including you. It ends when you stop choosing it for yourself. It ends when you stop choosing it for yourself. Rosalie took to Seville instantly, her linen skirts swaying as if they'd been waiting their whole life to dance through Spanish heat. And I followed her through cobbled paths where orange trees leaned over balconies like gossiping friends. Something older, something that had been gathering dust in the corners of my heart for decades. I felt present, not invisible, not background noise, present. And yet, even inside that growing clarity, another hook tugged at me. When did you first learn to apologize for existing too loudly? Who taught you that shrinking was safer than shining? The questions chased me as we explored cathedrals, tasted pastries sweet enough to make us close our eyes, and sat on stone benches watching street performers who poured emotion into every note. One afternoon, high on the sunlight and stillness, I found myself thinking about my notebook, the one I had bought in Lisbon and barely begun writing in. That evening in Seville, as the city cooled and lamps lit up like suspended moons, I finally opened it. And the moment the pen touched the paper, a floodgate inside me cracked. I wrote truths I hadn't dared to think for years, truths about how many celebrations I cooked for without anyone inviting me to sit and rest, truths about how often my voice was softened to avoid being too much, truths about how I had spent a lifetime being the reliable one, the available one, the you won't mind, right? One. Each sentence felt like peeling back a layer of dust from my own bones, and the hook sharpened. If a woman spends her whole life being useful, when does she get to simply be? As my thoughts spilled into the notebook, a message buzzed on my phone, another from my son, shorter this time. Mom, are you safe? That should have comforted me, but it didn't. Not because I doubted his concern, but because the concern arrived too late, wrapped in a fear of consequences rather than a fear of losing me. I put the phone face down and stared out the window, letting the night sounds drift in distant. Music, laughter, footsteps that belonged to people who didn't think twice about taking up space. That night sleep came in waves, restless and honest. And in the morning everything felt different. Rosalie noticed before I did. "You're standing taller," she said, squinting at me through her glasses as she wrapped a scarf around her neck. Confidence? Anger? We traveled next to Granada, the train carving its way through landscapes that belonged in paintings. I watched olive groves stretch beyond the horizon, watched small villages flicker by like forgotten memories, watched sunlight spill over mountains like gold being poured from a pitcher. And somewhere between one town and the next, I felt the shift again, subtle, quiet, powerful. A hook fluttered inside me. What if your life didn't end when they left you behind, but finally began when you chose not to wait at the doorway they closed? Granada was softer than Seville, gentler, calmer, like a deep exhale after holding your breath for too long. But even its beauty couldn't distract me from the message that arrived one morning, a single line from my son. "Mom, did we lose you?" I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally understood something terrifying and freeing. Sometimes silence isn't revenge, it's recovery. And recovery takes space. So I walked through the Alhambra gardens with Rosalie, letting fountains whisper around us, letting marble hallways cool my thoughts, letting ancient arches remind me that everything, relationships included, can crack and crumble and still be rebuilt, stronger and more breathtaking than before. When Rosalie took a photo of me leaning against an archway, I didn't pose, didn't force a smile. I simply stood as I was, older, wiser, tired, rising. That afternoon, as we sat under a shaded terrace sipping sweet mint tea, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Amelia. Voice message. "Grandma, Dad's scared, not angry. Scared. Scared of what he never noticed before. Scared of what he's losing. Scared of how much you're changing. I'm proud of you." Those last 3 words settled in my chest like a warm stone, solid, grounding, undeniable. It struck me then, not as a function, not as an obligation, but as a woman, and that visibility softened something in me I hadn't realized was hardening. I listened to the message 3 times, each replay smoothing the edges of decades-old wounds. And another hook rose. Isn't it strange how sometimes the youngest one in the family becomes the first to truly see you? That evening, back in the quiet of our little room, I stared at my reflection, hair slightly wind-tousled, cheeks flushed, eyes carrying stories with new weight, and I realized the truth I had been circling for weeks. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was finally becoming someone real. Freedom doesn't always come from going far. It comes from finally choosing a life where you're no longer afraid to exist in full size. Have you ever held a truth in your chest for so many years that when you finally speak it, even in a whisper, it feels like opening a door you didn't realize you were locked behind? That's what the morning in Cadiz felt like after the night Rosalie and I danced until our legs throbbed and our laughter cracked open something young inside us. The sunlight spilled into the room like it had questions for me, questions I'd avoided for decades, questions about what I wanted, not what I was needed for. I lay there for a while listening to Rosalie breathing softly in the other bed, feeling the soreness in my knees, feeling the strangeness of joy in my ribs. But beneath the joy something else pulsed, a truth I had swallowed long enough that it had turned into a stone inside me. A stone I was finally ready to lift. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, screen lighting up with my son's name again. Another missed call, another voicemail, 27 calls in 2 days. I didn't listen to any of them, not because I didn't care, but because hooks were clawing inside my mind. Why did they only hear your silence when it inconvenienced them? Why wasn't your voice worth listening to before it disappeared from their routine? Why does concern arrive only when control slips? I let the phone buzz until it stopped, then buzz again. Cadiz shimmered in early light, the sea sighing against the shore as if tired from holding so many secrets. I gripped the railing, feeling the cracked paint under my fingers, and thought of every year I'd spent in service, service to motherhood, service to marriage, service to expectations I never got to write. and I realized something sharp. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done being unseen. When Rosalie woke, she watched me for a moment with narrowed eyes, the way women who've lived a long time can sense the shape of change in another's shoulders. "Something's shifted," she said. "You're finally standing in your own story." Instead, we walked to the market by the river, where the noise was loud and alive. Vendors shouting prices, people bargaining with theatrical passion, children racing between stalls with sticky fingers and wild laughter. The smell of oranges, salt, and frying dough mixed with the warm chaos of morning. While Rosalie haggled over olives with the ferocity of a prize-fighter, I sat under a faded umbrella sipping a cold drink, watching the world move without waiting for me. That's when I opened my phone. Not to check missed calls, not to soothe someone else's panic, but because something in me needed clarity. Among the voicemails I ignored was one new notification, a voice memo from Amelia. Just seeing her name soften the air around me, I tapped play. "Grandma, I don't know if you'll hear this. I don't want to push you. I just want you to know I miss you. They're worried, but I don't think you're doing this to scare them. I think you're doing this because you finally remembered you deserve more than being left out. And I guess I wanted you to know I see you, even if they didn't for a long time." Her voice cracked at the end, the crack of a girl who hasn't yet learned how to hide heartbreak. I replayed the message, once, twice, a third time. Something inside me broke. Not painfully, but like an egg cracking, letting light spill through a shell that was too small. I went back to the hotel alone, while Rosalie went in search of a basket she insisted she needed for collecting memories, though she'd probably use it for holding books. In the quiet of the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, the yellow scarf in my lap, and held my phone the way one holds something fragile, important. Then, before fear could wrap its fingers around my throat, I pressed record. "David," I began, my voice steady, "I'm not angry, not any more, but I am different, and I need you to hear me without interrupting, without defending, without dismissing what you don't want to feel." I paused, listening to my own breath. "I'm not coming home to the role you built for me, the background role, the convenient role, the role that only matters when something needs to be fixed or someone needs to be cared for. If you want me in your life, it has to be as a person, a whole one, not the shrinking version you grew used to. I love you, but I won't come back small." I stopped the recording, stunned by my own words, how natural they felt, how long they'd been waiting. Then, without giving myself time to doubt, I hit send. I expected to feel guilt, panic, fear. But what washed over me instead was stillness, the stillness of a woman finally telling the truth without worrying if her truth made someone uncomfortable. When Rosalie returned, she found me sitting by the window staring at the sea. "You told him," she said simply. "How do you feel?" I searched for the word. Not free, not brave, not sad, something deeper. "Real," I whispered. "About damn time." That night, at a small local bar lit with amber lamps and smelling of wine-soaked wood, I listened to a fado singer whose voice cracked in places like old paint, but held strength in every break. She sang of longing, of being left behind, of rising. The music poured through me, as if it were stitching something back together. Sometimes the bravest moment in a woman's life is the one where she finally says enough, not to the world, but to the version of herself that learned to whisper instead of roar. Have you ever returned to a place that once felt like the whole world, only to realize you were never meant to fit inside the small version of yourself you left behind there? That was the feeling that settled over me as the train to Barcelona slowed into its final stop, the wheels screeching like they knew this wasn't an ending but a turning point, a quiet landing after a long flight toward myself. Rosalie sat beside me, her scarf wrapped tightly against the morning chill, humming an off-key tune she insisted was French, but sounded more like stubborn joy. I watched the city through the window, gaudy curves rising like impossible dreams, colors spilling down walls as if someone had painted the air itself, and a hook pulsed inside me. What if you were never meant to return as the woman they expect, but as the woman you finally became? We checked into a modest hotel tucked between two bookstores, the kind with wooden floors that remember every footstep. Rosalie unpacked slowly, folding her clothes with the tenderness of a woman who had learned to treat her own belongings with care because no one else ever had. "You're quieter today," she observed, not looking up. "Is it the city or the leaving?" I didn't answer, not immediately, because the truth was both. Barcelona felt like the last page of a chapter I didn't know I'd been writing, and tomorrow she and I would part ways, two women who met at a cafe by accident, but somehow ended up rewriting the shape of each other's loneliness. We walked that night through narrow streets lit by warm lamps, past balconies dripping with flowers that looked heavy with secrets. At dinner, I barely touched my fish, lost in thoughts that felt too large for the chair I sat in. What happens when the woman who returns is not the one they expect to welcome? Back in the room, sleep only came in pieces, broken by dreams of doors I'd closed softly but firmly. In the morning, Rosalie found me packing. "Going home?" she asked gently. "Eventually," I said. It was the closest thing to truth I had. She sipped her tea, studying me over the rim. "Just remember," she said, "you don't owe anyone the old version of you, not even the ones you love." And with that, with only a hug and a soft "soon," she left for Lyon, leaving behind silence that didn't feel empty, just honest. I spent one last night in Barcelona alone, sitting on the balcony with my notebook open and the city humming below me. I didn't write a list this time. I wrote a line: "I am returning, but not back." The next morning the airport felt different than the one I'd left weeks ago. Not cold, not intimidating, just a place between worlds. I boarded the plane with no trembling hands, no fear, no ache, only a quiet certainty that I was carrying home a woman my family had never met. And when I landed, no one was waiting. That didn't hurt the way it would have before. It almost felt appropriate, like the universe giving me the space to step back into my life on my own terms. The cab ride home passed familiar streets, the bakery where I used to buy Amelia cookies, the pharmacy where I once rushed for fever medicine, the park where my son fell from monkey bars at age 6, and none of it belonged to me anymore, not in the way it once did. When I unlocked my door, the house felt smaller, as if it had shrunk while I expanded. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and breathed in the absence of expectation. The silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like a reset. Within minutes my phone buzzed. "Are you home?" I typed back. "Yes." 20 minutes later she burst through the door with the kind of hug only teenagers give, the one that says everything they don't yet know how to put into words. She looked at me differently, too, with the understanding of someone who had seen the world crack open and realized love doesn't mean ownership. "You look new," she whispered. "I feel awake," I replied. We talked for hours about her art school dreams, about the drawing she made of me standing at the sea, about how she told her father that growing doesn't mean abandoning, it means expanding. And just as the sun dipped, the doorbell rang. My heart stilled. David stood there, hands uncertain, eyes tired. Laura hovered behind him, softer than I'd ever seen her. "We'd like to talk," he said quietly. I stepped aside, not as an invitation, but as acknowledgment. They sat at my kitchen table, not like owners of the space, but like guests. He tried to start 3 times before words came. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't know how far away you felt. I didn't know I'd stop seeing you. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't offer excuses. I let the silence hold him the way it had held me for years." "I'm sorry," he added, not dramatically, not rehearsed. I nodded. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgment. "I didn't leave to hurt you," I said. I left to find the parts of me I lost being everything to everyone." He swallowed hard. "Can we start over? Means you see me, not just when you need something. Not just when it's convenient. You see me." He nodded, and for the first time in years I believed he might actually try. They didn't stay long. Change never happens in a single afternoon, but when they left, something delicate and tentative remained in the air, like the first note of a song waiting to be continued. After the door closed, I sat alone with my tea, watching the shadows settle. I thought of Athens, of Florence, of Lisbon, of Seville, of Granada, of Cadiz, of Barcelona. I thought of Rosalie's dry humor, of the dancers in the plaza, of the sea wind tangling my hair, of the yellow scarf fluttering like a flag of reclamation, and a hook rose inside me. "You didn't just return home, you returned to yourself." I opened my notebook one last time and wrote, "I was never too old." I was simply never asked if I still dreamed. Now I don't wait to be asked. I go, and the final rehook settled over my heart like a sunrise. The journey didn't end when I came home, because once a woman remembers who she is, she never goes back to sleep.